married for 2 years, yet never touched, until the millionaire reached for her hand. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main characters. James Mitchell had it all. A self-made millionaire with a sharp mind, boundless ambition, and a lifestyle most people could only dream of. Born into modest beginnings, he built his empire from the ground up, conquering one business after another. His success was undeniable, and yet, despite all his wealth and achievements, there was something missing in his life. A feeling of connection, of warmth. 2 years ago, he made the decision to marry Sophia Bennett. It was not a love match, but a strategic move, driven by family expectations and his need for a partner who could complement his public image. Sophia, on the other hand, was the picture of grace and beauty, a woman who seemed to have everything going for her: intelligence, charm, and a quiet resilience. But in her marriage to James, there was one thing she lacked: love. In the beginning, their union was a mere formality. They signed the papers, exchanged vows in front of their families, and promised to support each other in the way that was expected of them. But from the start, there was no passion, no spark, no intimacy. James was distant, focused on his business, and Sophia, though kind and understanding, couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of loneliness in the marriage. They lived under the same roof, shared meals, attended events together, but there was no real connection between them. For 2 years, they existed side by side, strangers in their own home, each living separate lives. Sophia had learned to fill the void with work, hobbies, and friendships, but nothing could replace the need for affection. Meanwhile, James, despite his financial success, felt a quiet emptiness gnawing at him. He had achieved everything he'd ever wanted, but when he came home at night, there was no one to share it with. Their marriage, once full of hope and possibility, had become a cold and distant arrangement. It wasn't that James didn't care for Sophia. He did, in his own way. But the pressures of his career, his personal expectations, and the weight of their arrangement had created an emotional barrier he couldn't seem to break through. And for Sophia, her hopes of a loving marriage slowly began to fade. She had always dreamed of a partner who would love her deeply, someone who would cherish her and make her feel special. But as the days turned into months, and the months into years, her dreams began to slip away, replaced by the harsh reality of a marriage devoid of affection. So, what happened that changed everything? What was it that finally brought them together? Stay tuned, because the moment James Mitchell reached for Sophia's hand would be the turning point in their story, a moment that would change everything for both of them. 2 years into their marriage, things had settled into a monotonous rhythm. James Mitchell, despite his busy schedule, maintained the illusion of a perfect life, always with a confident, almost emotionless demeanor. He threw himself into his work, knowing that his empire needed his constant attention. The more he worked, the less he noticed the quiet despair creeping into his home. He had never imagined that a marriage could feel so empty. His success had brought him everything he wanted: money, respect, and influence. Yet, despite all that, his relationship with Sophia seemed like a hollow shell, one that existed merely to meet social expectations. Every evening, after a long day, he would retreat into his study, escaping into the quiet of his office, hoping that somehow, by focusing on his businesses, the emptiness he felt would go away. On the other hand, Sophia had slowly learned to accept her reality. She was no longer the young woman who had dreamed of a fairy tale marriage. She had been pragmatic enough to understand that life, especially in a marriage of convenience, rarely matched the ideals. She had accepted the coldness, the lack of affection, and had even grown used to it, at least outwardly. She spent her days pursuing various interests and investing in her own personal growth, but the longing for love, a longing that she had once harbored, remained. Still, there was a small part of her that yearned for something more. Maybe it was hope, or perhaps it was a belief that things could change. She had never given up on the idea that one day, her husband might look at her not just as a wife, but as someone he could truly love. But after 2 years, that hope had almost completely faded. One evening, as the clock struck 8, Sophia was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book in hand. The house was quiet, as it often was these days. She could hear the faint clicking of the keys from James's study in the next room. It was a sound she had become so familiar with, his way of shutting the world out. As she flipped another page, she couldn't help but feel the loneliness weigh on her chest. She had gotten used to it, yes, but it didn't make it any easier. The silence between them had become deafening. For a brief moment, she thought about getting up and joining him, but then she hesitated. What was the point? James had never once pulled her into his world, never once tried to bridge the distance that had grown between them. But tonight was different. James Mitchell, the man who had been a stranger in their marriage for so long, walked into the living room, his face softened by something unfamiliar. He didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, looking at her, as if considering something. The stillness in the room was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Then, almost as if in slow motion, he walked over to her. His hand, once stiff and formal, now reached out. He touched her arm lightly, as if testing the waters. Sophia froze, her heart racing. This was the moment she had never truly expected, the moment she had stopped hoping for, the moment that had taken 2 years to come. James Mitchell, the man who had barely acknowledged her existence in their marriage, had reached for her hand. There was no dramatic speech, no sudden revelation, but in that small act, something changed. For the first time in a long time, Sophia felt a spark of connection, a flicker of hope. And for James, the weight of his own loneliness finally began to settle in, making him realize that perhaps, all this time, he had been looking for love in all the wrong places. The silence between them wasn't just filled with words anymore. It was filled with something much deeper, a sense of vulnerability, of raw emotion, of a longing they had both kept hidden for far too long. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to pause, suspended in time. Sophia felt a mixture of surprise and relief flood through her. Her hand, once lifeless in its solitude, now rested in his. The touch was light, almost tentative, but the warmth of it was undeniable. She couldn't remember the last time they had shared even the smallest of gestures. And yet, here it was, a touch that carried more weight than words ever could. James, on the other hand, found himself frozen in place. He had reached for her hand without fully understanding why. For so long, he had been caught in the whirlwind of his own success, consumed by business and responsibility. The distance between them had seemed insurmountable, a barrier too thick to break. But now, with her hand in his, he felt a strange sense of calm, a connection he hadn't realized he'd been longing for. Sophia, he finally spoke, his voice softer than usual. I don't know how we got here. His words hung in the air, filled with uncertainty and vulnerability. Sophia turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent 2 years waiting for something, anything, that might show her that James truly saw her, that he truly cared. And now, standing before her, was a man who, for the first time, was acknowledging the distance between them. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like everything. I didn't know either, Sophia replied, her voice barely a whisper. She wanted to say more, to express all the feelings she had kept buried for so long, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply looked at him, her gaze steady, as if trying to understand the man standing before her. James took a deep breath, his hand still holding hers. I've been so caught up in everything, he said, his tone laced with regret. I never really looked at you, at us. I was too focused on the wrong things. Sophia could see the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time, she realized that this wasn't just about the lack of physical affection. It was about the emotional distance that had defined their marriage. They had both been living parallel lives, never truly connecting, and now they were standing at the crossroads, unsure of what came next. There was so much they had to say, so much they had neglected to address, but there was no rush. They had time now, and for the first time in a long time, Sophia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things could change. Maybe they could rebuild what they had once thought was lost forever. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges. Both of them knew that. However, for the first time in 2 years, they were facing those challenges together. James gently squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he was ready to try. to make things right. It was a small promise, but one that held a world of meaning. As they stood there, the weight of the past 2 years seemed to lift, if only for a moment. The silence between them no longer felt oppressive. It felt like the beginning of something new, a new chapter in their marriage, one that was full of unknowns, but also, just maybe, full of possibilities. As days passed, James and Sophia began to navigate this new, uncertain territory of their relationship. The small, tentative steps they took toward each other felt unfamiliar, but they were necessary. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations of love, just simple moments of connection, one after another. James started coming home earlier, no longer staying buried in his work for hours after dinner. He would join Sophia in the living room, watching TV or talking about their day. It wasn't much, but for Sophia, it was a shift. It was a sign that he was beginning to care, that he was starting to see her again. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, James looked at her with a look that was almost searching. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about us." Sophia turned her head to meet his gaze. For a moment, she felt that familiar wave of doubt. Had he changed his mind? Was this just another fleeting moment, soon to be forgotten? But his eyes were sincere, and his voice steady. "I've realized something," he continued. "I've been so focused on building everything outside of us, I forgot to build what really matters. Our marriage. Our connection." Sophia felt a warmth spread through her chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed him. There was no need for more words. The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, told her everything she needed to know. It wasn't just about the touch they shared that evening. It was about the recognition of what they had both lost and the desire to rebuild it. They started talking more about their hopes, their fears, their regrets. They began to share the things that had been left unsaid for so long, the things that had caused the walls between them to grow higher and higher. It wasn't easy. There were moments of silence, moments of discomfort, but each conversation brought them closer. Each moment of vulnerability brought them a little further from the coldness that had once defined their marriage. Sophia found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. She shared the small things, the quiet moments when she felt alone, the little things she had missed about him, the dreams she had set aside. James listened, truly listened, and he began to understand her in a way he never had before. He began to realize how much he had taken her for granted, how much he had neglected her needs, her desires, her dreams. He had been so focused on his own ambitions that he had failed to see the woman sitting beside him, the woman who had stood by him through everything, silently waiting for him to notice her. It wasn't a fairy tale, he knew that. He knew it would take time to rebuild what had been broken. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like it was possible. He wanted to make it work. And Sophia, for the first time in a long time, felt like maybe she wasn't so alone after all. There were still doubts, of course. There were still moments when she wondered if this was just a fleeting change, a momentary shift that would fade as quickly as it had come. But deep down, she felt a spark of hope. And that spark was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. James reached for her hand once again, his touch no longer hesitant. This time, it was confident, sure. "We're going to take it one day at a time," he said. "But I'm here. I'm really here." Sophia smiled, her heart lifting at the simple, yet profound words. She didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need perfection. All she needed was the promise that they would try together, that they would fight for something real. And that was enough. As the weeks passed, James and Sophia began to develop a new rhythm in their relationship. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They still had their ups and downs, but now there was an openness between them that had been missing for so long. James continued to show up for her in ways he never had before, not just as a husband, but as a partner. He started asking about her day, listening to her dreams, and making time for her in ways that didn't involve his business. It was strange at first, this new version of him, the man who was present, who was emotionally available. For so long, Sophia had lived in the shadow of his ambition, feeling like an afterthought in his life. But now it was different. It was as though he was finally seeing her, not just as his wife, but as an individual, someone with her own thoughts, hopes, and desires. One evening, after dinner, they sat on the patio, watching the sunset. The quiet beauty of the moment seemed to mirror their relationship. They were no longer rushing through life, no longer consumed by their individual worlds. They were simply together, sharing the same space, the same silence. "I've been thinking," James said, breaking the stillness. Sophia turned to him, waiting. "About what we've been through," he continued. "How far we've come." Sophia smiled softly. She had often wondered if this was even possible. Could they really rebuild what had been broken? Could a marriage that had started so cold, so distant, ever truly find warmth? But now, sitting next to him, feeling the quiet strength in his words, she believed it. They had come far, and there was still so much more ahead. "I never thought we'd be here," she admitted. 2 years ago, I thought we were just roommates." James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I know. I never realized how much I was shutting you out. I was so focused on everything else, I didn't see what I had right in front of me." There was no defensiveness in his voice, no excuses. He was speaking from the heart, and for the first time, Sophia felt that he truly understood her pain, her loneliness. "I've missed you," he added quietly. "Not just as my wife, but as the person you are, the woman I married." His words hit her like a wave, overwhelming yet gentle. She could see it in his eyes, the sincerity, the longing to make things right. They had both suffered in silence for so long, but now, in this moment, they were finally acknowledging it, together. "I've missed you too," Sophia replied, her voice soft, but filled with emotion. It was true. She had missed him, not the man who had been distant and preoccupied, but the man who was now sitting beside her, vulnerable, open, and ready to rebuild their life. They didn't need grand promises or extravagant gestures. They just needed each other and the willingness to continue this journey together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting. There was still a long road ahead of them. They both knew that. But for the first time in years, they weren't facing it alone. They were facing it together. And for Sophia, that was enough. James reached for her hand once more, and this time, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a promise. A promise that they would keep moving forward, step by step, day by day. Together. As the months went by, James and Sophia's relationship slowly but steadily transformed. They were no longer living in the shadows of their past, but were building something new, piece by piece. They had learned to communicate better, to understand each other's needs, and most importantly, to listen. Their conversations had deepened, moving beyond surface-level exchanges to more meaningful, vulnerable moments. James began to take an active interest in Sophia's life, in her passions, and in the small things that made her smile. He would ask about her day, genuinely curious, and listen without distraction. It was a stark contrast to the man he had been before, distant, wrapped up in his work, and unaware of how little he had truly known his wife. Sophia, on her part, was slowly learning to trust him again. She had spent so much time living in the silence between them, convinced that she was invisible to him. But now, as he started to show up in the small ways, she realized how much he had been trying to change, trying to be there for her in ways that mattered. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the old wounds flared up, when the past seemed too heavy to overcome. They both had scars, emotional and physical, from the years of neglect and isolation. But they were facing it together, no longer afraid to confront the discomfort, to sit with the difficult emotions. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, James looked at her across the table, his gaze warm and steady. "I've been thinking about us," he said quietly. "How far we've come." Sophia smiled, a soft, knowing smile. She had thought about it too. In the beginning, she had doubted if they could ever get to this point, but now, it felt different. There was a trust between them, something that had been earned through time, patience, and effort. "We've come a long way," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "But there's still a long way to go." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know, but for the first time, I believe we can get there. Together." And for the first time in a long time, Sophia felt a sense of peace. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward, knowing that they had both committed to making this work, to growing together. They had learned that love wasn't something that could be forced or rushed. It was something that had to be nurtured, something that had to be built over time. It was about the small moments, the quiet gestures, the shared laughter, and even the moments of silence. James reached across the table and took her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. He had always been the one to withdraw, to keep his distance. But now, he was choosing to stay, choosing to be present. "I'm here, Sophia," he said softly. "And I'm not going anywhere." Those words, simple yet profound, brought tears to her eyes. She had spent so long questioning whether he would ever truly be there for her, whether he would ever truly see her. And now, in this quiet moment, she knew. He was there. He was with her. And together, they were going to face whatever came next. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were no longer facing it alone. They had each other. And for Sophia, that was enough. Months continued to pass, and the small changes between James and Sophia became more apparent with each passing day. Their relationship had blossomed in ways they had never expected. There were still challenges ahead, but they were now facing them together. No longer was the silence that once defined their marriage a looming presence. Instead, there was a growing sense of understanding, a bond that they had both worked hard to build. James had stopped isolating himself in his study, and Sophia had stopped waiting for him to notice her. They both understood that their marriage required effort from both sides, and they were finally ready to give it. One evening, they sat on the back porch, watching the stars in the sky. The air was cool, and there was a peaceful stillness around them. It had become a ritual for them to spend some time together at the end of each day, no matter how hectic it had been. "I never thought we'd get to this point," Sophia said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't either," James replied, turning to face her. "But I'm glad we did." He reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. There was a comfort in the simple gesture, a reassurance that they were in this together. "I've learned so much about myself these past few months," he continued. "About the things I took for granted, about how much I've neglected the most important parts of my life." Sophia nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She had seen the change in him, the growth. It hadn't been easy, but it had been real. "And I've learned a lot about myself too," she said softly. "About my own needs, my own worth." There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from two people who understood each other on a deeper level. For so long, they had lived in their own worlds, never truly seeing each other. But now, they were fully present in each other's lives, ready to face whatever came next. "We still have a lot to work through," James said after a moment, his voice serious. "But I believe in us now. I believe we can make it." Sophia smiled, her heart light with hope. "I believe that too." The truth was, there would always be challenges. Life wasn't perfect, and neither were they. But they had come to realize that it wasn't about avoiding the hard times. It was about how they chose to handle them, how they chose to move forward together. They had found a new rhythm in their marriage, one built on mutual respect, understanding, and love. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, they felt like they were truly starting to live the life they had always dreamed of. James squeezed her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "We've got this," he said, his voice full of conviction. Sophia looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. "We do." It was simple, but in that moment, they both knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, stronger than ever. And that was all that mattered. As the seasons shifted and time passed, James and Sophia found themselves more in tune with each other than ever before. The changes they had made together didn't happen overnight, but there was a steady transformation in their lives. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but there was also an undeniable connection, a strength in their bond that neither of them had thought possible just a few months ago. One Saturday morning, James surprised Sophia by preparing breakfast. He had never been the type to cook, always preferring the convenience of takeout or dining out. But this time, he wanted to show her how much he appreciated her, how much he had changed. The smell of fresh pancakes filled the kitchen as Sophia walked in, her eyes widening in surprise. "You're cooking?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. James, standing at the stove with an apron on, looked up at her, his face lighting up with a grin. "I figured it was time to try something new." The gesture was simple, but to Sophia, it was everything. It wasn't about the pancakes. It was about him taking the time to do something just for her, something that showed he cared. They sat down at the table together, the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the window. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the kind of quiet happiness that only comes when two people are truly at ease with one another. As they ate, they talked about their plans for the future. James mentioned a few business ventures he was considering, and Sophia shared her hopes for further pursuing her passions outside of their home. They talked about the small things, the places they wanted to travel to, the experiences they hoped to have together. For the first time in a long time, their future didn't seem so uncertain. They were excited about it, together. After breakfast, they went for a walk in the park, hand in hand. The weather was perfect, crisp but sunny, with the leaves just beginning to change color. It was the kind of day that made everything feel possible. As they walked, James looked over at Sophia, a thought crossing his mind. "You know," he began, "I've been thinking a lot lately about how far we've come." Sophia turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "I know," she said with a soft smile. "It's hard to believe sometimes, isn't it?" James nodded. "It feels like we're finally finding our way. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for what we've been through. It's made us stronger, and it's made me realize what really matters." Sophia squeezed his hand. "I feel the same way. We've had our struggles, but they've led us to this point, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." The weight of their past had started to lift, replaced with something lighter, something brighter. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about living, about thriving together. They had found their way back to each other, and it felt like the beginning of something even more beautiful than they had ever imagined. As they reached the end of their walk, James stopped and turned to face her. "You know," he said softly, "I've never felt this way before. I feel like we're really in this, for the long haul." Sophia looked at him, her heart full. "I do too," she whispered. And in that moment, they both knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. They were no longer just two people in a marriage. They were partners, allies, and friends. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. As the months rolled on, James and Sophia's bond grew stronger, their days filled with more moments of joy and understanding. It wasn't just about the big gestures anymore, the grand promises or declarations. It was about the little things. It was about the way James would remember her favorite coffee order and bring it to her on mornings when she needed a pick-me-up. It was about the way Sophia would laugh at his jokes, even the ones he knew weren't funny, just to make him feel good. It was in the way they spent evenings cooking dinner together, laughing over burnt toast, and sharing their favorite music while washing dishes. Those small moments added up to something much greater than either of them had imagined. There were still occasional bumps in the road, as there are in any relationship, but now, when they faced challenges, they didn't shy away from them. Instead, they approached each obstacle with patience and determination. They understood that the key to making things work wasn't about perfection. It was about learning, growing, and always showing up for each other. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, watching the world go by, James looked at Sophia with a soft smile. "You know, I used to think love was about doing everything perfectly, about never making mistakes," he said, his voice thoughtful. Sophia turned her head to look at him, curious. "And what do you think now?" she asked. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I think love is about being real," he said slowly. "It's about showing up even when things aren't perfect. It's about supporting each other when life gets tough. It's about forgiveness and patience, even when things get hard." Sophia smiled, feeling the weight of his words sink in. She had learned that lesson too. Through their ups and downs, she had come to understand that love wasn't a fairy tale. It was a choice, a commitment to weather the storms together, to hold on to each other through the highs and lows of life. "I agree," she said softly. "It's not about perfection. It's about knowing we're in this together, no matter what." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the steady hum of the world around them. The wind was gentle, and the warmth of the sun felt like a promise. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. As they grew older, James and Sophia knew they would face more challenges. Life had a way of throwing unexpected hurdles in their path. But now, they had the tools to navigate it together. They had trust, respect, and a deep love for each other that couldn't be shaken. "I love you," James said, his voice quiet but full of sincerity. "I love you too," Sophia replied, her heart swelling with emotion. And as they held hands, their fingers entwined, they both knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together, stronger than ever. The past was behind them, and the future was a new chapter waiting to be written. But for now, in this moment, they were exactly where they needed to be.